The water in the jacket was boiling. Sergeant John Basilone could hear it through the metal, a steady hiss that told him the gun had been firing for hours. His hands moved by instinct now, feeding another belt into the Browning, fingers finding the mechanism in darkness so complete he couldn't see the Japanese soldiers he was killing. It was the night of October 24th, 1942, and somewhere in the jungle beyond his position, 3,000 men from the Imperial Japanese Army's Sendai Division were trying to reach Henderson Field. The machine gun in front of him was obsolete. That's what the manuals said. The M1917 Browning, with its water-cooled barrel and 47-pound weight, was a relic from the previous war. It had been designed in 1900, tested in 1917, and shipped to France, just in time to see limited action in the trenches. By the time Basilone's battalion landed on Guadalcanal in September, the Marine Corps was already ATO, transitioning to the M1919A4, a newer, lighter, air-cooled weapon that didn't need water and weighed 31 pounds instead of 47. The M1919 was modern. It was portable. It was the future. But on this night, in the mud and darkness south of Henderson Field, with Japanese soldiers screaming banzai as they threw themselves at Marine positions, Basilone wasn't firing an M1919. He was manning an M1917, an obsolete water-cooled machine gun that required a 4-man crew to move and a constant supply of water to function. And that obsolete weapon was the only thing standing between the Japanese assault and the vital airfield, that if lost would hand the entire Guadalcanal campaign to the enemy. The gun fired in sustained bursts. Not short, controlled bursts like the training manuals recommended. Sustained fire. Long, continuous streams of 30-caliber rounds that turned the barrel cherry red inside its water jacket. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave. Basilone could hear them in the darkness, could hear their officers shouting commands, could hear the distinctive sound of grenades being thrown. His section of 2 machine guns was supposed to cover a narrow corridor in the Marine defensive line. But one gun crew was already dead. The other gun had jammed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Basilone left his gun, ran through darkness under enemy fire, to the jammed weapon, cleared it, repositioned it, and got it firing again. Then back to his own position. More belts. More water. The jacket temperature was approaching the boiling point of water at sea level, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Any hotter, and the water would turn to steam too quickly to cool the barrel effectively. But the gun kept firing. What Basilone didn't know, what nobody in his battalion fully understood yet, was that his obsolete weapon was about to prove something fundamental about the nature of defensive warfare. The very features that made the M1917 heavy, cumbersome, and outdated for mobile operations made it perfect for exactly this situation. A sustained defensive action where mobility didn't matter, where what mattered was the ability to fire continuously, hour after hour, without the barrel overheating and the gun failing. The M1919 air-cooled guns that the Marines were transitioning to could fire faster in short bursts. They were easier to move. They didn't need water. But they also couldn't maintain the kind of sustained fire that this night was demanding. Their barrels would overheat. They would need to be changed. They would force gunners to pause, to wait, to give the enemy precious seconds to advance. The obsolete M1917 didn't have that problem. As long as Basilone could keep water in the jacket and ammunition in the gun, it would keep firing. All night if necessary. And this night, that was exactly what it would have to do. The machine gun Basilone was firing that night had been born from a fundamental problem of modern warfare. When John Moses Browning filed his patent for a recoil-powered automatic gun in 1900, Machine gun technology was dominated by Hiram Maxim's toggle lock design. The German Maschinengewehr 08 weighed 137 pounds. The British Vickers, similarly based on Maxim's principle, was barely lighter. Both required water cooling, both required massive tripods, both were effective, but impossibly heavy. Browning's design was different. Instead of Maxim's complicated toggle lock mechanism, Browning used a sliding block locking system. The bolt locked to the barrel extension through a vertically sliding block that rose up to lock and dropped down to unlock as the gun cycled. It was simpler, fewer parts, less that could break. The entire weapon, when filled with water and mounted on its tripod, weighed 93 pounds compared to the Maxim designs, that topped 150 pounds when similarly equipped. But weight wasn't the innovation that mattered most. What mattered was sustained fire capability. Browning's water cooling system worked through a cylindrical jacket surrounding the 24-inch barrel. 7 pints of water filled this jacket. As the gun fired, heat from the barrel transferred to the water. The water absorbed this heat and began to boil. Steam collected at the top of the jacket and was vented through a hose into a condensing can, where it cooled back to liquid and could be reused. This system allowed something that air-cooled weapons simply couldn't match: truly continuous fire. In testing at Springfield Armory in May 1917, Browning's prototype fired 39,500 rounds before experiencing any parts breakage. A later production model underwent an even more remarkable test, firing more than 21,000 rounds in a continuous burst that lasted 48 minutes and 12 seconds. Nearly 50 minutes of uninterrupted automatic fire. The United States Army, desperate for machine guns as it mobilized for World War I, adopted the design immediately. Nearly 40,000 M1917 guns were delivered to the Army before the armistice in November 1918, though not all reached France in time to see combat. Those that did proved themselves in the trenches, where their sustained fire capability made them ideal for defensive positions. But by the time the war ended, military thinking was already evolving. The static trench warfare of the Western Front was giving way to concepts of mobile warfare, mechanized infantry, combined arms operations. The cavalry wanted machine guns they could mount on vehicles. Tank units needed weapons that didn't require external water supplies. Infantry commanders wanted guns light enough to move forward with advancing troops. The Army began developing air-cooled versions. The M1918 emerged first, designed for aircraft where the rushing air could cool the barrel. Then came the M1919, initially designed for tanks, but eventually developed into multiple variants for different roles. The M1919A2 appeared in the 1920s with an 18-inch barrel for mounted cavalry. The M1919A4, finalized in 1936, became the standard. A 24-inch air-cooled barrel in a perforated jacket, 31 pounds without the tripod, portable enough for a two-man team to carry and deploy. The M1919A4 represented everything modern. It eliminated the need for water, saving 15 pounds of weight in the cooling system alone. It used a lighter tripod. It could be moved quickly. It fit the military's vision of dynamic, mobile warfare where positions changed rapidly and machine gun teams needed to advance with rifle squads. The M1917, by comparison, seemed like a dinosaur. Too heavy, too dependent on water supplies, too slow to reposition. By 1942, when Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the corps was already transitioning to the newer air-cooled guns. The M1917 was being phased out, relegated to secondary status, considered obsolete technology from a previous era of warfare. But obsolete doesn't mean useless. It just means designed for different circumstances. And the circumstances on Guadalcanal were about to prove that. Sometimes older designs solve problems that newer ones create. Henderson Field was everything. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, understood this immediately. The Japanese had been constructing an airfield on the island's northern coast. If completed, that airfield would put Japanese bombers within range of Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. It would extend Japan's defensive perimeter deeper into the South Pacific. It would make any future Allied offensive vastly more difficult. The initial landing caught the Japanese by surprise, approximately 11,000 Marines under. Major General Alexander Vandergrift came ashore and secured the partially completed airstrip within 36 hours. The Marines named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading a bombing run at Midway. The first American aircraft were landing on the captured runway. But taking the airfield and holding it were different propositions entirely. The Japanese reacted with fury. Within days, they began reinforcing their forces on the island, running destroyers and fast cruisers down the slot at night to deliver troops while avoiding American air attacks during daylight. These high-speed runs, which the Marines called the Tokyo Express, deposited soldiers but couldn't carry heavy equipment. The Japanese troops on Guadalcanal fought without adequate artillery, without vehicles, without the logistical support that American forces enjoyed. What the Japanese did have was determination, tactical skill, and numerical superiority. October, they had concentrated approximately 36,000 troops on the island. The Marines defending Henderson Field numbered about 23,000, including recently arrived Army reinforcements from the 164th Infantry Regiment. The Japanese plan was straightforward: overwhelm the American defensive perimeter with a massive night assault, recapture Henderson Field, and turn the island back into a Japanese base. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake personally commanded this offensive. He had brought the 17th Army's artillery to Guadalcanal, including 100mm cannon and 150mm howitzers. On the night of October 14th, 2 Japanese battleships bombarded Henderson Field with nearly 1,000 massive shells, the most intense single bombardment American forces faced during the entire war. The shelling damaged or destroyed most of the aircraft at the field and shook Marine morale. But the bombardment also telegraphed Japanese intentions. Vandergrift knew a major ground assault was coming. He strengthened his defensive perimeter, particularly the southern approaches where the jungle provided cover for attacking forces. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, held a critical section of this line south of Henderson Field. Puller's battalion included D Company, commanded by Captain Louis Ditter. Within D Company, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. These sections were equipped with M1917 water-cooled Brownings, not because the Marines preferred them, but because that's what was available. The newer M1919A4 guns were in short supply. The M1917S, though obsolete, were plentiful. Basilone had learned machine gunnery in the Army during a previous enlistment in the Philippines, where he earned the nickname Manila John. He had re-enlisted in the Marines in July 1940, trained at Quantico and Paris Island, and deployed to the Pacific in May 1942. He knew the M1917 intimately. He understood its quirks, its requirements, its capabilities. He knew that in defensive positions, where the gun didn't need to move, the water cooling system was an advantage, not a liability. On the afternoon of October 24th, Puller's battalion observed increased Japanese activity to their front. Patrols reported large enemy forces moving through the jungle. Sergeant Ralph Briggs, positioned 3,000 yards forward with a small observation post, telephoned Puller's command post at 9:30 that evening with a stark message. "Colonel, there's about 3,000 Japs between you and me." The Japanese were coming, and when they arrived, Basilone's obsolete machine gun would be waiting. Basilone's 2 sections of machine guns occupied positions along a narrow corridor in the 1st Battalion's defensive line. Each section consisted of one M1917 Browning, mounted on an M1917A1 tripod. The guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, covering approaches through the jungle where Japanese forces would have to advance. Behind each gun, ammunition boxes were stacked, wooden chests containing 250 rounds each in cloth belts that fed from left to right into the weapon, the M1917, a one that Basilone would personally man, weighed 36 3/4 pounds when filled with water. The tripod added another 53 pounds. The weapon sat low to the ground on its tripod, giving the gunner a stable firing platform but requiring him to operate from a prone or kneeling position. The gun's cyclic rate of fire was between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on the specific weapon and how it had been maintained. But cyclic rate was different from sustained rate. Cyclic rate measured how fast the gun could fire if ammunition fed continuously. Sustained rate measured how fast it could fire over extended periods without damaging the barrel. For air-cooled weapons like the M1919A4, this distinction mattered enormously. The M1919 could achieve its cyclic rate in short bursts, but sustained fire would overheat the barrel within minutes. Gunners were trained to fire in controlled bursts, to pause between bursts, to change barrels if the weapon had been firing heavily. The M1917 didn't have that limitation. As long as water remained in the jacket, the gun could fire at or near its cyclic rate continuously. The water absorbed heat faster than air ever could. Simple physics. Water has a specific heat capacity of 1 calorie per gram per degree Celsius, approximately 4 times higher than air. This meant water could absorb 4 times as much thermal energy as the same volume of air before reaching the same temperature increase. The 7 pints of water in the pant M1917's jacket weighed approximately 7.5 pounds. That water could absorb tremendous amounts of heat. Liquid to steam absorbed even more energy, roughly 540 calories per gram. This heat of vaporization meant that boiling water carried away heat much more efficiently than simply hot water. Basilone understood these principles practically, if not scientifically. He knew that as long as he kept water in the jacket and didn't let it boil dry, the gun would keep firing. He had positioned 5-gallon water cans near each gun position. He had stockpiled ammunition belts. He had trained his crews on the procedures for clearing jams, for changing worn parts, for maintaining sustained fire under combat conditions. The gun's effective range was approximately 1,500 yards, though accuracy degraded significantly beyond 800 yards. For the defensive position Basilone occupied, effective range mattered less than volume of fire. The jungle terrain limited visibility to perhaps 200 yards at most. The Japanese would have to close within that distance to reach the marine lines. At 200 yards, the M1917 was devastatingly effective. Each .30 caliber round left the barrel at approximately 2,800 feet per second. At close range, these rounds could penetrate light cover, could punch through logs, could defeat improvised fortifications. Against human targets in the open, they were lethal. A single round could incapacitate. A sustained burst could cut down multiple attackers. Basilone's assistant gunners had specific duties. One man handled ammunition, ensuring belts fed smoothly into the gun and didn't tangle. Another managed water supply, monitoring the jacket temperature by touch and adding water when needed. A fourth man served as security and runner, watching for threats the gunners might miss while focused on their sector and carrying messages to other positions when the field telephone lines inevitably failed. The Japanese attack, when it came, would test every aspect of this system: the guns, the crews, the clam, ammunition supply, the water supply, and most critically, the fundamental design philosophy that had made the M1917 obsolete for mobile warfare, but kept it ideal for defensive fighting. The Japanese assault began at 3:30 in the morning on October 25th, with repairet, artillery fire that lit the sky, walking back and forth across the defensive line. Then came the infantry. Hundreds of soldiers from the Sendai Division's 29th Infantry Regiment emerged from the jungle, advancing in waves, their officers shouting commands, soldiers screaming banzai. As they charged, Basilone opened fire. The M1917 hammered out rounds in long, sustained bursts. Tracer rounds every fifth cartridge showed him where the bullets were going, arcing red lines into the darkness. He could see Japanese soldiers falling, could see others stumbling over bodies, could see the attack wave fragmenting under the machine gun fire, but they kept coming. More soldiers, more waves. The assault showed no sign of stopping. His assistant gunner fed belt after belt into the weapon. The gun fired continuously, not in the short, controlled bursts that training manuals recommended. Continuous fire. The barrel inside the water jacket was glowing red-hot, heating the water to boiling. Steam began venting from the condensing hose. The assistant gunner monitoring the jacket temperature shouted a warning. The water was approaching critical temperature. They added more water from the 5-gallon can, cool liquid flowing into the jacket, absorbing heat, keeping the barrel from warping. The gun never stopped firing. This was the critical difference. An M1919 air-cooled gun firing at this rate would have overheated in minutes. The barrel would have glowed, red-hot, visible even in darkness. The gunner would have been forced to stop, to change barrels, to wait for cooling. Those pauses, even brief ones, would have given the Japanese time to advance to close, the distance to reach the Marine positions. The M1917 didn't pause. It couldn't overheat as long as water remained in the jacket. Basilone could maintain fire indefinitely, limited only by ammunition supply and the mechanical endurance of the weapon's moving parts. The gun had been tested to fire 21,000 rounds continuously. Basilone wouldn't approach that number tonight, but he would fire thousands of rounds in sustained bursts that no air-cooled weapon could match. Japanese grenades began falling near his position. Mortar rounds impacted close enough to shower him with dirt. He ignored them, kept firing. To his right, the second gun in his section stopped. He could hear men screaming. The crew was hit. He had to keep his gun firing to cover their sector, to prevent the Japanese from exploiting the gap. More Japanese soldiers appeared. The attacks were coming in waves, one regiment attacking, falling back, another moving forward. The Japanese commanders were throwing everything at this section of the Marine line. If they could break through here, they could reach Henderson Field. The entire defensive position would collapse. Basilone's gun was the anchor. As long as it kept firing, the Japanese couldn't mass for a breakthrough. The sustained fire forced them to spread out, to take cover, to approach in small groups that rifle fire could handle. But if the gun stopped, if it overheated or jammed or ran out of ammunition, the Japanese would surge forward in mass and overwhelm the position. The water jacket was boiling violently now. Basilone could hear it, a steady roar of steam venting into the condensing can. The heat was intense. The gun's receiver was hot to the touch, but the barrel remained protected inside its water jacket, cooled by the continuous circulation of water being heated, turned to steam, condensed back to liquid, recycled. An hour passed. Then, another. The gun fired on. Japanese bodies were piling up in front of the position, so many that they were blocking the field of fire. Basilone sent men forward during brief lulls to drag bodies aside, to clear the killing zone, to restore unobstructed lanes of fire. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The obsolete weapon was doing something no modern gun could do, firing continuously, hour after hour, without failing. By midnight, both of Basilone's machine gun sections had been reduced to barely functional status. The second gun's entire crew was dead or wounded, leaving only 2 Marines capable of carrying on. Basilone left his own position, ran through Japanese fire to the disabled gun, got it back in action, repositioned it for a better field of fire, then returned to his own weapon. He was now effectively commanding both guns, moving between positions, clearing jams, replacing worn parts, directing fire. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. The wooden ammunition boxes that had been stacked behind the positions were empty. Spent brass casings littered the ground. The cloth belts had been fed through the guns and lay in tangled heaps. Basilone sent runners back to request more ammunition, but the supply lines were cut. Japanese infiltrators had worked their way behind the Marine positions. No resupply was coming forward. Basilone made a decision that would later feature prominently in his Medal of Honor. Citation. He would go get the ammunition himself, and moved back through the defensive positions toward the ammunition dump. Japanese soldiers were between him and the supplies. Some accounts suggest he fought his way through with a pistol and machete. What is certain from the historical record is that he reached the ammunition, loaded himself with fresh belts, and fought his way back to the gun positions. The weight he carried defies easy comprehension. Each ammunition belt with 250 rounds weighed approximately 15 pounds. Basilone carried multiple belts, perhaps 60 to 80 pounds of ammunition, through hostile territory, under fire, back to guns that couldn't stop firing without giving the Japanese their breakthrough. Private Nash Phillips, who served in the same unit, later recalled, Basilone had a machine gun on the go for 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food. He was in a good emplacement and causing the Japanese lots of trouble, not only firing his machine gun, but also using his pistol. When the ammunition ran low again shortly before dawn, on the second day, Basilone repeated the journey. By this point, he had been awake for over 40 hours, had been in continuous combat for most of that time, had been firing, moving, repairing, and resupplying machine guns without meaningful rest. The physical toll was enormous, but the guns had to keep firing. Mechanical reliability that bordered on miraculous. These were weapons that had been manufactured decades earlier, that had been shipped to the Pacific, that had endured tropical humidity and coral dust and rough handling. They were supposed to be obsolete. They were supposed to have been replaced by newer, better designs. But when everything depended on sustained fire, when failure meant Japanese soldiers would overwhelm the Marine positions, the old guns worked. The water cooling system that made them heavy and cumbersome proved to be exactly what the situation demanded. Each time the barrel temperature rose to dangerous levels, the water absorbed the heat. Each time the water began to boil too rapidly, adding cool water from the 5-gallon cans brought the temperature back down. The system was simple, robust, and nearly impossible to defeat through thermal stress alone. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese assault was faltering. Their casualties were catastrophic. The bodies in front of Basilone's positions numbered in the dozens, then scores. The sustained machine gun fire had prevented them from massing, from organizing coordinated attacks, from achieving the breakthrough they needed. Individual soldiers who reached the Marine lines were engaged with rifle fire and grenades. But the mass assault, the overwhelming charge that should have swept through the defensive positions, never materialized. The machine guns wouldn't let it happen. When the sun rose on October 25, 1942, the ground in front of Basilone's position looked like an abattoir. Japanese bodies lay in heaps where the machine gun fire had caught them. Some had made it within 50 yards of the Marine lines before being cut down. Others had fallen farther back, killed as they emerged from the jungle. Marine patrols sent forward, after the fighting stopped, counted the dead. The numbers varied by source, but conservative estimates placed at least 38 Japanese soldiers killed directly in front of Basilone's two-gun positions. The broader battle statistics were even more staggering. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had been virtually annihilated. Of the approximately 3,000 soldiers who attacked the Marine positions that night, Japanese sources later acknowledged losing between 800 and 900 dead, with hundreds more wounded. American casualties in Puller's battalion were significant but far lower. 42 Marines killed, 126 wounded. The ratio spoke to the effectiveness of defensive firepower, particularly machine gun fire. Basilone's M1917 guns had fired thousands of rounds during the engagement. The exact count is lost to history, but based on the rate of fire and duration of combat, estimates suggest each gun fired between 3,000 and 5,000 rounds over the course of the night. The barrels were worn, but functional. The water jackets had done their job. The guns that were supposed to be obsolete had performed exactly as John Browning had designed them to perform a quarter-century earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, recognizing what Basilone had accomplished, immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The citation, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, detailed the specific actions: moving an extra gun into position under fire, repairing another gun and personally manning it, fighting through enemy lines to resupply ammunition when supply lines were cut. But the citation couldn't fully capture what had actually happened that night. It couldn't explain the sustained fire capability that had prevented a Japanese breakthrough. It couldn't detail the physical endurance required to keep those guns operating for hours without pause. Basilone became the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. The ceremony took place in Australia in May 1943, with Major General Alexander Vandergrift presenting the medal. Basilone's response was characteristically humble. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." The M1917 machine guns received no medals, no recognition, no official acknowledgement that obsolete technology had proven superior for this specific application. But word spread through Marine units across the Pacific. The old water-cooled guns worked. In defensive positions where sustained fire mattered more than mobility, they outperformed the newer air-cooled weapons. Marines who had dismissed them as relics from World War I began requesting them for defensive emplacements. The irony was sharp. The military had spent 2 decades developing lighter, more portable machine guns because mobility was the future of warfare. The M1919A4 represented everything. Modern doctrine demanded air-cooled, weighing 31 pounds, easily moved forward with advancing infantry. It was the right weapon for offensive operations, for rapid advances, for mobile warfare. But Guadalcanal wasn't mobile warfare. It was defensive fighting from fixed positions against massed infantry assaults. In this context, everything that made the M1917 obsolete made it perfect. The heavy weight didn't matter because the guns didn't need to move. The water requirement didn't matter because positions had water supplies. The complex cooling system didn't matter because sustained fire capability mattered more than simplicity. The battle for Henderson Field continued for weeks after October 25th. Japanese forces launched additional attacks, all repulsed with heavy casualties. But the critical moment had passed. The largest Japanese offensive had failed. The window for recapturing Henderson Field had closed. By November, American reinforcements and superior logistics began turning the tide definitively in favor of the defenders. The M1917 Browning served throughout the remainder of World War II. Despite officially being superseded by the M1919A4, Marine units continued requesting them for defensive positions on islands across the Pacific. At Tarawa, in November 1943, water-cooled guns provided sustained fire during Japanese counterattacks. At Peleliu in September 1944, they anchored defensive positions in the rugged coral ridges. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, they were dug into positions covering the beaches. The guns' sustained fire capability proved valuable in situations the pre-war planners hadn't anticipated. When Mitchell Page, another Marine sergeant, held a defensive position on Guadalcanal with his machine gun section on October 26, 1942, just one day after Basilone's action, he too relied on the M1917's ability to fire continuously. Page's Medal of Honor citation described him moving from gun to gun as crew members fell, keeping the weapons firing against successive Japanese assaults. The water-cooled, guns kept working. Even as late as the Korean War, M1917 guns remained in service, particularly for defensive positions along the main line of resistance. Their ability to fire sustained defensive barrages made them useful for stopping Chinese and North Korean mass infantry assaults. The last M1917s in regular United States service were reportedly on the machine gun infiltration course at Fort Benning, Georgia, where their sustained fire capability was an advantage for long nights of shooting over the heads of trainees crawling beneath the guns. The irony of the M1917's legacy is that it vindicated a principle military planners had tried to move past, that specialized weapons for specific roles often outperformed general-purpose weapons in those specific roles. The post-World War I development philosophy had pushed toward lighter, more mobile, more versatile weapons. The M1919 series embodied this philosophy. But versatility came with compromises. The M1919 couldn't sustain fire like the M1917. It couldn't provide the same volume of defensive firepower over extended periods. This tension between specialization and versatility continued throughout military small arms development. After World War II, the concept of the general-purpose machine gun emerged, epitomized by weapons like the German MG-42 and later the American M60. These guns attempted to combine the sustained fire capability of heavy machine guns with the portability of light machine guns. But even these weapons made compromises. Quick-change barrels allowed sustained fire by swapping out overheated barrels, but this was more complex than simply adding water to a jacket. John Basilone never saw the full legacy of the weapon that saved his position that night. He returned to the United States after Guadalcanal, participated in war bond tours, and could have remained stateside in a training or public relations role. He refused. He requested to return to combat, turned down a commission as an officer, and deployed with the 5th Marine Division to Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, the first day of the invasion, Basilone led his machine gun section in an assault on Japanese fortifications. He destroyed a blockhouse, guided a tank through a minefield under fire, and was killed by a mortar round near Airfield No. 1. He was 28 years old. His Navy Cross citation for Iwo Jima noted his valiant spirit of self-sacrifice. But perhaps the greater sacrifice was that he understood something about warfare that peacetime planning often missed. That there is no perfect weapon, no universal solution, no single design that solves all tactical problems. There are only tools designed for specific purposes, and the wisdom to recognize when an obsolete tool is exactly what the situation demands. The M1917 was that tool. Obsolete by doctrine, perfect by circumstance. And on the night of October 24th and 25th, 1942, absolutely irreplaceable. The broader lesson from Basilone's stand extended far beyond machine gun design. It revealed something fundamental about how militaries prepare for war versus how wars are actually fought. The interwar period military planners who developed the 1919 series weren't wrong about the future of warfare. Mobile operations, combined arms tactics, and rapid advances did characterize much of World War II. The M1919A4 was an excellent weapon for those operations. But warfare rarely conforms entirely to predictions. Guadalcanal forced Americans to fight a different kind of battle. Static defensive positions, limited logistics, prolonged engagements from fixed emplacements. In this environment, weapons that had been designed for the previous war's circumstances proved ideal. The M1917 was a World War I trench weapon. Guadalcanal, in many respects, featured World War I-style defensive fighting, dug-in positions, overlapping fields of fire, sustained defensive barrages, against massed infantry assaults. The Japanese attackers faced their own technological and doctrinal challenges. Their infantry tactics emphasized aggressive night attacks, close combat, and overwhelming fighting spirit. These tactics had worked against Chinese forces in mainland Asia, where Chinese armies often lacked adequate automatic weapons. But against Marines equipped with multiple machine guns per company, supported by artillery and mortar fire, the Japanese tactics resulted in catastrophic casualties. Japanese after-action reports from Guadalcanal expressed shock at American firepower density. One captured document noted that American units seemed to have machine guns everywhere, that sustained fire never slackened, that attacking forces were cut down before reaching American positions. What seemed like inexhaustible firepower to Japanese soldiers was partly the result of water-cooled weapons that could fire continuously without barrel changes. The industrial disparity between the United States and Japan also manifested in the Guadalcanal campaign. American forces, despite being at the end of long supply lines, maintained adequate ammunition stocks. The M1917 guns had ammunition because American factories were producing it in enormous quantities. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled to supply their troops on the island. The fast destroyer runs that brought reinforcements couldn't carry sufficient heavy equipment or supplies. Japanese soldiers often fought on reduced rations, with limited ammunition, with inadequate medical supplies. This disparity would only grow as the war progressed. By 1943, American industrial production had reached levels that Japan simply couldn't match. But in October 1942, on Guadalcanal, the outcome wasn't yet certain. The battle for Henderson Field was genuinely in doubt. If the Japanese had broken through the Marine lines, if they had recaptured the airfield, the entire strategic situation in the South Pacific would have changed. One obsolete machine gun, operated by one sergeant who understood how to maximize its capabilities, helped prevent that outcome. Not alone, certainly, artillery fire, rifle fire from infantry, leadership from officers like Chesty Puller, courage from countless Marines all contributed to the defense. But Basilone's M1917s provided the sustained fire that anchored the defensive position, that prevented Japanese forces from massing for a breakthrough, that killed enough attackers to break the assault's momentum. The water in those gun jackets was boiling, the steam was venting into condensing cans. The barrels inside were glowing red, but the guns kept, firing all night, hour after hour, doing exactly what John Browning had designed them to do in 1900, what they had been tested to do in 1917, what they proved they could still do in 1942. Obsolete technology. Perfect application. The difference between defeat and survival. When military historians analyze the Guadalcanal campaign, they focus on naval battles, air superiority, logistics, and grand strategy. These are important. But sometimes history turns on smaller moments. A sergeant who knew his weapon, a machine gun that wouldn't quit, and water that kept boiling through the longest night of the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.